The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to the FY 2021 CoC Program Competition Bidders Conference. This presentation is being brought to you by the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services on behalf of the Baltimore City Continuum of Care. This is Paroma Nandi from the Mayor's Office speaking, and I'll be introducing some of my colleagues through the rest of the presentation. We'll do a quick overview of the agenda. So the FY 2021 NOFO overview and timeline, what's new with this year's application, HUD Policy and Priorities, funding priorities and eligible projects, threshold requirements, match requirements, and then preparing the project budget. We'll also go over some information about the project applications and then provide some resources and additional application reminders. At the end of this presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. Just note that for this webinar, everything is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides on the MOHS website today. All attendees will be muted to prevent background noises. And for the Q&A session, you'll be able to submit your question using the question box on the GoToWebinar dashboard. Please note that only questions about the competition process and the application templates will be answered during this webinar. If you have a specific question about your new renewal or expansion project, please send it to HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov. And then if your question is not answered during the webinar, just keep note that an FAQ will be posted to the MOHS website, and we'll be updating that throughout the competition. Okay, so I will pass it to my colleague, Katie York, to go over the overview and the timeline.
Thanks, Paroma. So just a little bit about the funding source that we have as part of our competition for this program, where it's coming from, and how our local competition will roll out in terms of timeline. So the CoC NOFO is referring to federal funding available through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as part of a nationwide annual competition for homeless services providers. CoC NOFO stands for the Continuum of Care Notice of Funding Opportunity. So as part of this competition, the Baltimore City Continuum of Care receives anywhere between $20 to $24 million each year, depending on a number of factors, such as increases and decreases in fair market rents, new projects being awarded, and any projects that do not apply for renewal. HUD requires each community that wants to receive funding to conduct a local competition to determine which projects are included in the ultimate application to HUD that includes a project ranking list. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our local competition timeline. The NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, was released on August 18th of this year. As of September 3rd, our local competition procedures were published, including our timeline and competition guidance, as well as the request for proposal and project application forms. Note that all project applications will be due to the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services by October 5th at 5 p.m. Any projects submitted after this date will not be considered eligible for the competition. On October 15th, reallocation notifications will be issued to all of our renewal projects, indicating whether the project is renewed, rejected, or if the level of funding has been reduced. On October 20th, any appeals to the project reallocations for renewal projects will be due to the Mayor's Office. On October 29th, we intend to have the final project ranking sent to the Continuum of Care for approval. And new and renewal projects will be notified of the acceptance or rejectance and their ultimate project ranking. By October 29th, the draft Continuum of Care application, including applications from all projects, will be sent to the Continuum of Care for final review and input. And November 10th, we will have the public posting of our final Continuum of Care consolidated application. Like I mentioned, that is all projects all in one place. And then on November 15th, we'll be submitting the final application to HUD in its entirety. Next slide, please. So there are three parts as you know, due as part of the NOFO submission. we've got the CoC application, which really speaks to 3 different key points, including how much progress the continuum of care has made towards ending homelessness in that jurisdiction, a note of really who's at the table and what stakeholders are actively involved in the work to end homelessness, and then some details on the strategies, policies, and initiatives being implemented by the continuum of care as part of that goal to end homelessness. The second part is project ranking. As we mentioned, all applications received are reviewed and issued a rating, and then ultimately ranked in terms of competitiveness, essentially. So the ranking is really affected by how the continuum of care has aligned their projects with HUD priorities. It assesses if the continuum of care is using a data-driven and objective process for the allocation of funding. And lastly, a bit about performance evaluation for all of the renewal projects. The third part is the project application themselves, which includes details on how the requested projects will operate once funded, and details as to whether the project is eligible and if it meets basic HUD thresholds to receive funding. Next slide. So some information about the funding that we anticipate to be available as part of the FY 2021 competition. At our baseline, we have what's known as the annual renewal demand for Baltimore City, or the ARD, which this year comes to $24,131,740. Note that this is the sort of minimum base amount that the Continuum of Care is eligible to apply for, and includes the funding for our youth homelessness demonstration program projects. There's also $1,206,587 that's available as part of our regular bonus project funding. This is the maximum amount of bonus funding that we are eligible to apply for as a continuum of care, and does not include any new projects that may be achieved through reallocation of existing funds. Next, we have the domestic violence bonus project funding. This year, our community is eligible to apply for up to $2,879,723 in that domestic violence bonus project category. Fairly self-explanatory. The project population for any of these new projects would have to serve victims of stalking, trafficking, or survivors of domestic violence. Lastly, we have the CoC planning grant funds, which this year comes to a total of $723,952. And this is the funding that provides support for staffing for the collaborative applicant, as well as covering some basic operations costs for HUD-required continuum of care activities. So as a whole, the available funding for this year's competition is $28,942,002. Next slide, please. So a bit about how funds are allocated as part of this competition. We have the Resource Allocation Committee that forms part of the Continuum of Care Board, which oversees the development of our competition and the submission itself. As part of this strategy, they are required to develop the annual or multi-year funding strategy for allocating CoC funding according to our local need, HUD policy priorities, and system performance. The Resource Allocation Committee, or RAC, is also responsible for really reading and analyzing the annual Notice of Funding Opportunity, developing our local reallocation strategy, the project rating and ranking criteria, and then utilizing past data on performance and programs to evaluate and rank project applications. The RAC is also responsible for developing the communication plan for informing the continuum of care, all stakeholders, and ensuring we have full participation from the community as part of this competition. They are responsible for approving our final submission as part of the annual Continuum of Care application to HUD. And lastly, for overseeing the work of the collaborative applicant, or the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services, as we work to prepare the NOFO submission. Next slide. The local funds will be allocated according to a strategy that's been developed by the Continuum of Care. As we mentioned earlier, the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services is what's known as the collaborative applicant for the Baltimore City Continuum of Care. This means that MOHS is responsible for facilitating the local request for proposals, or RFP, as part of this competition to solicit new, expansion, and renewal project applications that align with the priorities and directives of the CoC's Resource Allocation Committee. We're also responsible for collecting and preparing data at the system level and project level for use by the Resource Allocation Committee to determine those reallocations, project scoring, and ranking. And lastly, for preparing and submitting the 3 parts of the application that we mentioned earlier: the annual CoC application, the project ranking chart, and all project applications to HUD in accordance with decisions made by the Resource Allocation Committee. Next slide. All right, and I will turn it over to you, Paroma.
Thank you. So I'll briefly go over what's new in this year's NOFO, and I highly recommend for any agency that is interested in applying for either a new renewal, expansion application that they also review in detail HUD's Notice of Funding Opportunity. All right. So in this year's NOFO, there's some clear directives on what is new. So one of the top priorities is that HUD will incentivize CoCs that create projects that coordinate with housing providers and healthcare organizations to provide permanent housing and rapid rehousing. So this is something that our Continuum is looking at to prioritize for any new applications. HUD has also increased the number of points awarded in this year's NOFO related to CoC coordination with any public housing agency, and here in Baltimore, that is the Housing Authority of Baltimore City. It's also revised its evaluation of the racial disparity from the FY 2019 competition and has added additional points to promoting racial equity related to the local CoC competition. Additionally, there's a new section added in this year's NOFO, which is to promote inclusion in the local planning process to include current and former persons with lived experience of homelessness. And not surprisingly, we do see some information about COVID-19. So what's new in this CoC's NOFA is that that CoCs that face challenges due to the outbreak of COVID-19 affecting individuals and families experiencing homelessness in congregate and non-congregate shelter housing. So the part of it is to address those challenges and how our community was able to coordinate and overcome some of those challenges. So that information is going to be quite important in this year's NOFO as well. Additionally, similar to that, the coordination of CoC dollars with the Emergency Solutions Grant regarding to the CARES Act funding. And as we mentioned here, along with many other communities, Baltimore City also did not take part in the Unsheltered count for 2021, also known as the PIT count. So in this year's NOFO, HUD has determined that the sheltered count, which is also known as our HIC, our housing inventory count, is a better reflection of the overall changes. And so they did indicate that they are expecting communities to conduct a PIT count in the next year. But for this year's NOFO, we'll be using the HIC information. Additionally, something new in this year's NOFO, per the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act, it indicates that youth age 24 and under must not be required to provide third-party documentation of homelessness as a condition of receiving services and funding in the FY21 NOFO. Again, this is new information, and within the NOFO, it does indicate that this supersedes any other rule or information in previous NOFOs. So youth serving providers may serve unaccompanied youth ages 24 and under, or families headed by youth 24 or under who have any unsafe primary nighttime residence and no safe alternative to that residence And HUD interprets living in unsafe situations as having an unsafe primary nighttime residence and no safe alternative to that residence. So this is not only includes our YHDP projects that serve youth specifically, but for any youth serving providers. So again, in this year's HUD Policy Priorities, we don't see too many changes from previous years, but you'll see here that the partnering with housing and health and service agencies is listed as a new priority. We'll quickly go through each of these. So priority 1, again, this hasn't changed in past years. So ending homelessness for all persons. Projects really should identify, engage, and effectively serve all persons experiencing homelessness. Measure performance using local data that considers the challenges faced by all subpopulations. That includes veterans, youth, survivors of domestic violence, the LGBTQ population, partnering with housing, healthcare, and supportive services providers to expand housing options such as permanent housing, supportive housing, housing subsidies, and rapid rehousing. And then using local data to understand the highest needs and length of time to develop housing and support services for individuals experiencing homelessness. Priority 2, again, housing first is continued to be a priority by HUD, which indicates, prioritizing rapid placement and stabilization into permanent housing that does not have service participation requirements or preconditions. Funded projects should move people quickly into permanent housing, and COCs should measure and help projects reduce the length of time people experience homelessness, which is one of the performance metrics that is measured within our continuum. Also, a part of this is COCs should engage landlords and property owners to identify housing, and then removing barriers to entry by adopting client-centered service methods. Priority 3, reducing unsheltered homelessness. Again, COCs should identify permanent housing options for all people who are unsheltered, and services should be tailored to include physical and mental health services, and that also include substance use disorder services for folks that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. HUD indicates that this is a priority in recent years as the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness has risen. That includes the rising number of encampments in many communities. Although our Baltimore City's PIT count data from previous years has shown a decrease in unsheltered homelessness, our COC has noted that the PIT only provides a snapshot of one night. Priority 4 is improving system performance. So COCs should use system performance measures to determine how effectively they are serving people. The use of coordinated entry or also coordinated access within our community as a process to promote participant choice, coordinate homeless assistance and mainstream housing and services to ensure people receive assistance quickly, and that it's open, inclusive, and the process is transparent. COCs should review all renewal projects to determine effectiveness and that's really evaluating their system performance by reviewing their annual performance reports, also known as APRs. The COC should also look for opportunities to implement continuous quality improvement and process improvement strategies. So system performance measures include, but are not limited to, average length of homeless episodes, rates of returns to homelessness, rates of exit to permanent destinations. And then effectiveness includes the idea of cost effectiveness of projects. And then also it's important to note that due to COVID-19, in this year's NOFO, HUD has reduced the points for the performance and data quality section of our application because they have noted that many projects and communities and COCs were challenged this year. Again, we have the expectation and will anticipate that points for that section will increase for next year's NOFO. Priority number 5, again, this is something that has been referenced within the NOFO quite a few times, which is partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. So COC should be working closely with public and private healthcare organizations and assist program participants to obtain medical insurance to address healthcare needs. Partnering with the Housing Authority of Baltimore City and state and local housing organizations to utilize coordinated entry. That was a typo there, increase housing units and provide housing subsidies, help COC program participants exit to permanent housing using housing choice vouchers or other available housing options outside of the COC dollars, and then partner with local workforce development centers to improve employment opportunities, and that's really a focus within all of our rapid rehousing projects. Using cost, performance, and outcome data, COC should be able to improve how all available resources are utilized to end homelessness. And so again, this has been a large focus within this year's NOFO on how to maximize these partnerships to increase mainstream and other community-based resources. Priority 6 is, again, to advance racial equity. Here in Baltimore City, we do have our Race Equity Action Committee, which is part of our Continuum of Care. And so COC should be emphasizing the system and program changes to address racial equity, and should be reviewing local policies, procedures, and processes to determine where to address racial disparities affecting individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Nearly every community, HUD notes that nearly every community, Black and Indigenous and other people of color, are substantially overrepresented in the homeless population. So again, this is a huge focal point for this year's NOFO. And then this is a new section with additional points, which is priority 6, which is to engage persons with lived experience in decision making. So COC should include people who are currently or formerly experiencing homelessness in local planning, and then people with lived experience should determine how local policies may need to be revised and updated, participate in COC meetings and committees as stakeholders, providing input on decision making, and also related to the local competition process. And then COC should also look to seek opportunities to hire people with lived experience. So again, just to note that these 7 priorities are for our continuum of care, but we do look within each project that's applying for funding that their project reflects these priorities. And so where it's possible, you want to ensure that you focus your application to ensure that you're including these priorities within your project design or programming. With that, I'm going to pass it to Dana to discuss funding priorities and eligible projects and some more details.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dana Moore. I'm one of the accountants here at MOHS, and I'll be discussing your funding priorities and eligible projects, and slightly some changes that will be taking place. So one of the things that is strongly emphasized by HUD this year is reallocation of funds. So in a nutshell, reallocation is a process used to shift funds in whole or in part from existing eligible renewal projects to create one or more new projects without decreasing the annual renewal demand. HUD will not award funds to a new project unless the project was created through reallocation, or the COC has demonstrated to HUD's satisfaction that projects are evaluated and ranked based on the degree to which they improve the COC's system performance. Reallocation can only be requested through the NOFO competition, and it cannot be done at any other time throughout the operating program year. projects that request a partial reallocation cannot reduce the number of units or households served or the scope of services. So in a nutshell, COCs are required to reallocate the funds from lower performing projects to higher performing projects. And HUD views the reallocation through monitoring, visits, and APRs, but also gathers additional data through the annual competition. If COCs do not demonstrate an ability to effectively review system performance, HUD can recapture the funds. Next slide, please. Okay, so this chart notes the how the COC funding components have changed over time, and we went back to begin at fiscal year award 14 to show you how the components within the COC have changed over time. Particularly note that there was a significant change in FY15 with the reduction of temporary housing, excuse me, and fiscal year 16 with the introduction of rapid rehousing. HUD renewed all funding for FY20 based on the FY 2019 application without a competition, most likely due to the impacts of COVID. The award increase is due to changes in the annual FMR. Next slide, please. So what goes in the ranking? HUD requires communities to rank projects in 2 tiers. The project ranking must reflect HUD's funding priorities, local need, and a data-driven process for evaluating individual project performance. Prior to the ranking process, the COC completes a full performance evaluation and scoring of all projects and determines whether to include each individual project in the ranking. For example, we have Tier 1 projects. HUD typically has enough funding to award all Tier 1 projects in communities across the nation. Tier 1 projects are considered relatively safe from funding cuts. If a project does not meet HUD's threshold review, it may not be funded, and HUD will move down the list of projects. Moving to Tier 2 projects. Tier 2 projects are considered at risk of not being funded. Tier 2 projects are scored by HUD according to the federal funding and policy priorities. Baltimore's Tier 2 projects compete with other communities' Tier 2 projects for funding. For example, Tier 1 is equal to 100% of the COC's annual renewal demand minus the annual renewal amounts, or ARAs, of YHDP renewal and YHDP renewal projects. Any new or renewal project application can be placed in Tier 1. For example, Tier 2 is the difference between Tier 1 and the maximum amount of the COC renewal, reallocation, and COC bonus funds that a COC can apply for, but does not include YHDP renewal, YHD replacement, COC planning, or projects selected with DB bonus funds. Slide, please. Okay. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Wade.
Hi, Dana. Thank you. This is Michelle Owens-Good. I'll present on the FY 2021 eligible projects. There are 6 project types. The first would be permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is permanent rental assistance and support services, and can be housed in either site-based locations or scattered site units. Tends to have a long length of stay with good housing outcomes. Currently, we have the data shows a 95% retention rate, or to move to other permanent housing. The target population in HUD priority for permanent supportive housing is chronically homeless and have disability and high vulnerability. This project type is allowed for renewal, and this project type can also be reallocated and for regular bonus funds. So yes, the project can be a new or expansion or an existing project. This project is not eligible, this project type, I'm sorry, is not eligible for DV bonus funds. The second eligible project type is rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing is short and medium-term rental assistance and supportive services for up to 24 months. The length and the amount of assistance is flexible and individualized according to household needs. Only housing in scattered site is allowed for this project type. Rapid rehousing tends to have short lengths of assistance with good housing outcomes. The data currently shows that 75 to 80% of individuals exit to permanent housing, and less than 15% of individuals enrolled in rapid rehousing return to homelessness. HUD encourages the use of rapid rehousing as a first intervention, including households who may end up needing permanent supportive housing assistance. For rapid rehousing, the housing first approach must be utilized. The target population in HUD priority, everyone, this meets across our clients served, with a preference for households with medium to high vulnerability scores. This project is allowed for renewal, and yes, it can be a new or expansion of an existing project. This project is also eligible for DV bonus funds, and it can also be a new or expansion of a project. Next slide, please. Transitional housing. Transitional housing is up to 2 years of sheltered and supportive services, typically provided in site-based locations. The target population are youth, victims of DV and trafficking. It's also allowed for renewal. There will be no reallocation and regular bonus funds for this project type, and this project is also not eligible under DV bonus funds. The Joint Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing, also known as Joint THRRH, uses transitional housing as crisis housing with target lengths of stay under 90 days. Coupled with rapid rehousing supports to help households exit transitional housing quickly and obtain permanent housing. HUD recommends for communities that have limited shelter or transitional housing options for specific populations. Examples of these would be youth and domestic violence populations. Again, the target population as mentioned for this project type are youth and victims of DV and trafficking. Is allowed for renewal, reallocation of regular and regular bonus funds, and also for DV bonus funds. Supportive services only. Supportive services only entails street outreach, drop-in centers, and case management. Includes projects dedicated to coordinated entry. The target population may vary by the project type. This project type is allowed for renewal. However, in regards to reallocation and regular bonus funds, it's only for coordinated entry projects, and it's not eligible for DV bonus funds. Our last project type is the HMIS, Homeless Management Information Systems. HMIS provides operational support to HMIS lead agencies to ensure full HUD compliance and be able to produce data, performance, and reports for HUD requirements on behalf of the CoC. There is no specific target population, as this project type is for CoC operations. It is renewal allowed, and it's not applicable for reallocation, regular bonus funds, and or DV bonus funds. Next slide, please. Threshold requirements. Project eligibility threshold. Projects will be evaluated based on HUD's priority eligibility threshold as follows. Provide documentation that the organization is a nonprofit 501c3 tax exempt organization or another city government agency. Projects will be evaluated based upon their ability to demonstrate the financial and management capacity and experience to carry out the proposed project as detailed in the application and the capacity to administer federal funds. The population to be served must meet the definition of homeless under the Federal Reg 24 CFR 578.3. Projects must also agree to participate in the local HMIS system. However, victim service providers must use a comparable database that meets the needs of the local HMIS. Next slide, please. Additional requirements. Applicants must maintain an active SAM registration. Applicants must provide a valid DUNS number, registered and active. Applicants must be in good standing with the state of Maryland, and the good standing certificate must be dated within 30 days of the application. The applicant must provide last 2 years single audit or independent financial audit that demonstrates the financial and management capacity. The applicant should also be committed to operating the program under the Housing First model, provide documentation of at least 25% cash or in-kind match. Organizations applying for DV bonus funds must have a history of serving individuals, families, and/or youth fleeing domestic violence, dating violence, or human trafficking. Lastly, projects must have reasonable costs and reasonable costs for their project and ensure that the project design is financially feasible. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Wade Carver, for the match requirements.
Good morning, I'm Wade Carver with the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services. I'm going to discuss the match requirements for the NOFO competition. Match requirements for all projects. Match refers to actual cash or in-kind resources contributed to the grant. All costs paid for with match funding must be for activities that are eligible under the CoC program, even if the recipient is not receiving CoC program grant funds for that particular activity. Excuse me. All grant funds must be matched with an amount no less than 25% of the awarded grant amount, excluding the amount awarded to the leasing budget line with cash or in-kind resources. Match resources may be from public, not statutorily prohibited by the funding agency from being used as a match, or private resources. Recipient of CoC awards must document match along with their monthly expenditure reports. Next slide, please. Again, referencing all projects, every project must match 25% of the total amount of the grant minus leasing costs with cash or in-kind resources. All costs under matching funds must be for activities that are eligible under the CoC program, even if the recipient is not receiving program grant funds for that activity. Cash match and in-kind match needs to be documented by a letter. Note, program income can be counted as cash match. You must indicate that in your application and must provide a description of the source of program income and how it will be documented. In-kind contributions can include the value of any real property equipment, goods, or services contributed to the project as match, provided that if the recipient or subrecipient had to pay for them with grant funds, the cost would have been eligible under subpart D. In-kind match for services provided by a third party must also be documented with a memorandum of understanding. Next slide, please. This slide shows the match calculations for programs without leasing and with leasing. And I would also encourage you to reference the HUD Exchange website for additional guidance with the match calculations. Next slide, please. Eligible cost for match. All match contributions, cash or in kind, in the COC program must be for eligible costs and activities per Subpart D of the COC program interim rule, regardless of whether the activities or costs are included in the HUD approved project budget. The eligible categories of match are as follows: supportive services, assessment of needs, assistance with moving costs, case management, child care, education services, employment assistance, food, housing/counseling services, legal services, life skills, mental health services, outpatient health services, outreach services, substance abuse disorder treatment services, transportation utility deposits. Transportation and or utility deposits. Operating, maintenance/repair, property taxes and insurance, replacement reserve, building security, electricity, gas and water, furniture, and equipment that is either leased and or purchased. Next slide, preparing of project budgets.
Yes, so in preparing the project of budgets, we have the next slide reviews some of the items, the eligible items that was mentioned in the prior slides, but broken out into more of a grid format. So each of the projects that you'll see on the left-hand side, permanent supportive housing, site-based, permanent supportive housing, scattered-based, so on and so on. It shows at the top which of those projects are eligible to receive which budget line item for each of those projects, as is denoted by a check mark in the grid. And if you have questions about that, please put a question in the chat and follow up.
Okay, now for a bit more about the project applications by type, starting with renewal project applications. Again, all of this information is available on the website, including all forms. Note that for renewal project applications, your agency will need to use the FY 2021 Grant Inventory Worksheet, or GIW, that's posted on the website in order to complete your project budget. The budgets must match the GIW exactly, so note that that includes matching in every category for rental assistance, supportive services, operations, etc. Similarly, the application in terms of the number of requested units and the size of the units must match the GIW. Within each budget category, you can request your desired funding in all of the eligible line item activities. Please refer to the list of eligible costs within the project application guide. Lastly, note that the projects portion of the administrative category is 50% of the total award because project administrative funding is split between the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services and the service provider. Lastly, you'll need to provide all supporting documentation listed in the RFP. Next slide. For renewal projects that are seeking to expand services, note that HUD is allowing project expansion of both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects in order to add new services, new units, or persons served to existing projects. This will require a new project application to be submitted, but if approved by the Continuum of Care and HUD, would simply be added to the existing project when awards are made, resulting in one grant agreement. This would require the submission of 3 applications: the expansion project, renewal project, and new project. You'll need to provide all supporting documentation listed in the project application guide, but notably only 1 copy of that supporting documentation. New projects selected for inclusion as part of the CoC application to HUD will work with MOHS staff to adjust budgets and service numbers according to the total amount of funding ultimately available for that project. Next slide. Lastly, for new project applications, including both domestic violence and non-domestic violence projects, note that your agency will need to develop the proposed budget according to the number of households you propose to serve, as well as detail the staff and program resources required to run the program successfully. Please be very clear and detailed in your description of each line item in your budget. For example, for staff costs, you must include the number of full-time employees and the percentage of staff time for each employee spent on the project, especially if they're split between multiple funding streams. If you are requesting rental assistance, please complete the chart in the application with the number of requested units to calculate the total rental assistance costs. Note you may not request less or more than the fair market rent rates listed in the chart. So for example, if you were to select 7 one-bedrooms, you would need to complete a budget that has 7 one-bedroom units times the fair market rental rate for a one-bedroom unit for Baltimore. Note that new projects that are selected for inclusion in the CoC application to HUD will work with MOHS staff to adjust budgets or service numbers according to the total amount of funding ultimately available for the project. All right, and I will pass it to Adiola.
Hello, everybody. My name is Adiola. I am the YHP Program Compliance Officer. So I'm going to be talking about the YHP Renewal Application. So if you are submitting a YHP Renewal Application, you must use the YHP Renewal or Replacement Application that's found on the MOHS website. These renewal applications will need to use the FY21 Grant Inventory Worksheet that's posted on the MOHS website to complete the project budget. The total amount for each category, such as rental assistance, supportive services, etc., must match the grant inventory worksheet exactly. Similarly, your project's applications, requested amount, requested number and sizes of units must also match the grant inventory worksheet. Within each budget category, you can request your desired funding in each eligible line item, so you can refer to the list of eligible costs in the project application guide. The project receives 50% of the portion awarded for the administrative category. And also make sure that you provide all supportive documentation that's listed in the RFP. Next slide. For YHP replacement applications, so by submitting a YHP replacement application, this indicates that your organization has determined that it wants the ability to provide non-CoC program eligible housing and services to eligible youth experiencing homelessness. And so incorporating any of the special YHP activities into your project design requires your organization to submit a replacement project. So your YHP replacement project application cannot exceed the 1-year annual renewal amount, the ARA. And also you'll be using the FY21 grant inventory worksheet that's posted on the MOHS website to complete the project budget. Your organization will need to indicate how this YHP replacement project meets the goals that are established in the coordinated community plan within the description of the scope of the project. And so please make sure that you're reviewing the coordinated community plan that's posted on the Journey Home website. And again, make sure that you're providing all supporting documentation that's listed in the RFP. Next slide. So more about YHP replacements. So note that supplemental information will be required for your YHP replacements. That includes the special YHP activities request. So you'll need to include a description of the special YHP activities that you're requesting. This is including a justification and the special section of the regulation or statute that the applicant is requesting that HUD waives. Additional documentation is also needed to explain YHP project innovations. Make sure that if your organization is interested in submitting a YHP replacement application, that you email hspapplications@baltimorecity.gov before September 22nd. So please let us know as soon as possible, but of course no later than September 22nd. Next slide. So we do have some resources available for you all to review. So make sure that you're reviewing all the NOFO documents that have been released by MOHS. This includes the, this includes HUD's FY21 NOFO program competition document, the CoC interim rules, as well as these documents on the MOHS website, the local competition process and the timeline, the request for proposals, the CoC NOFO Bidders Conference, and FAQs that will be posted, the project application templates, as well as the grant inventory worksheet. And this is for renewal projects only. And then some reminders. So carefully review the local application, the local competition process and timeline, the local project application guide, and the NOFO that's released by HUD. If you do have any questions about your application, make sure that you submit them before September 22nd so that they can be processed. And you can do this by emailing hspapplications@baltimorecity.gov. Please ensure that your proposed project design aligns with best practices included in the project application guide and that they're meeting HUD stated objectives. And keep in mind that project applications are due Tuesday, October 5th at 5 p.m. And again, you'll be submitting those to hspapplications@baltimorecity.gov. Next slide. All right, so now we are going to have a question and answer section. Next slide. So you all will be able to submit your questions in the chat. We'll put the seminar on mute for 5 minutes while we're collecting your questions. Thank you.
So while questions are coming in, I'm going to start answering a few of these. The recording will be posted by the end of the day, along with the project slides. We'll also be sharing an FAQ to the website as soon as tomorrow with additional information. So there's a question about whether the application should be submitted through email or whether the application should be submitted to eSnaps. So if you are a direct grantee of a HUD award, you will need to submit the application in eSnaps. That's only for a couple projects within our Continuum of Care. If you don't know, feel free to just send a email to HSP Applications to confirm, but most applications will be submitted via email. So if a project is working with a partner organization on an expansion grant or a new grant, the question is whether they would both apply or if one organization would take the lead. So I believe it depends on whether you're applying for the new or expansion project, but one organization should take the lead in applying for the grant. You should indicate if there is another organization that would be providing staffing. If you have some more specific questions on that application, please email HSP applications at baltimorecity.gov so we can give you some more details. If you're applying as a support services only project, your project will still be ranked with all of the CoC projects. The only projects that will not be included in the CoC ranking are the YHD renewal and replacement projects. There's a question about whether bonus projects can be used to create more affordable housing. So if I'm understanding that question correctly, funding is not eligible for capital costs within this project. So let me know if I need to expand on that. The list of required supportive documentation is listed in the request for proposals, but also make sure you review the CoC local guidance. If you have additional questions as you're going through the grant application, email HSP applications@baltimorecity.gov. So this is the email address. Make sure you submit your questions before September 28th, and ideally as soon as possible. Some questions will need to be directed to HUD, and so we'll be submitting AAQs for some specific questions, and the turnaround time can be from anywhere from 3 to 7 business days. So if you do have a question, make sure you send it to us as soon as possible so that we can get you the most accurate information. All right, we'll stay on for another minute to see if there's any more questions. But if you haven't had a chance to think through what your questions are yet, or still working through the application, really highly recommend you email us at hspapplications@baltimorecity.gov for further assistance, specifically if you have specific questions on your project application. Just note that because this is a competitive competition, MOHS is not able to answer or assist, answer questions that will assist with your project application. We can really only answer technical questions related to the local guidance or the HUD guidance. All right, well, thank you all for your time today. Have a great Thursday. We're excited for this process to begin, and we hope to hear from you all soon. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. Thank you again for your time today, and just note that this recording will be posted shortly.